In the previous videos, you might have seen in-page configuration mentioned a couple of times. This video is going to cover what that is and showcase how it can be used in its simplest form. We're going to use it to mark which articles to apply purchasing options on using the article ID property, instead of binding the purchasing options directly to the article by using direct URL. Let's therefore dive into how in-page configuration looks like. Before we start, you will need to modify the source code of the website, just like we have done with introducing the connector script on the web page. So you will need firstly the access to your source code and also the possibility of publishing that source code. Just to remind you a bit, it should look like this. So this is our Economist Article 2 that we will be modifying, and we will see a familiar script being loaded here. This is the connector script. The only thing we need to do in order to add in-page configuration is adding the configuration before the script is loaded. So I'm going to go into my head here, and I'm going to make a space between title and script, and I'm going to paste. You will see this in the documentation. This is the article ID that we will be using for this particular article. Now you will see some differences between this connector script that's loaded and this particular script that's written here, that is the in-page configuration. This is of type application JSON, and it has an associated ID, which is LaterPay Connector. Do not modify this ID, because this way the script knows how it will be loading and applying parameters from the backend configuration. Now that's basically all the work we need to do in order to define an article ID. Make sure you save this and that it's published to your server, and then you should go back to your connector dashboard, more precisely to the single purchases. Now in the single purchases screen, you will define a new purchase just like you have done before. You will firstly be asked for the title of the single purchase, and now remember, this is for your internal reference only, so you can name it however you want. Let's call it in-page single purchase 50, because we're gonna set a price of 50 cents there. Now we have here a selection again of either exact path or article ID. Remember, we have used the exact path before. Now let's go the article ID route. So we're gonna click on article ID. Below we have to specify the article ID that we have specified back in our back in the web page configuration, that is in the in-page configuration. So this is going to be single purchase. So it's just like we have specified here. And then we just set a price. So let's set a price for 50 cents, pay later. Finally, we are going to bind this to the single purchase 199 template, because this is the template that we have used on Economist Article 2 before. So we know how the content looks like. If we click on save, we're going to see that the single purchase has been added. And if we go back to Economist Article 2 and we refresh it, we're going to see that a single purchase has appeared. Now perhaps you're wondering, why did we go the article route at all? That is the article ID route at all. Why not always define a number of articles here on single purchase, specifying them in the exact path, so just adding paths here that you would like to have? That's a perfectly valid solution. If you remember back in our first video when we were introducing connector, I mentioned that connector can be used in many different ways, and all of them are valid, but they are all made for different use cases that you might have. For this particular use case of having this article here and having this article here and defining some individual purchases, and this is probably the simplest use case that you will ever see, both of these approaches are valid. However, as we know, life is more complicated than that. You will not always have static websites like we have here. Sometimes you will have websites that are generated dynamically from code. Sometimes you will have a large number of websites that are generated automatically. In this case, it would be rather tedious to add all of them here manually every time a new web page is published, especially if we are talking about a blog site, or generally a site that has a huge number of articles. In this case, it would be much better if you would automatically define that with every new web page that's published, you get the same article ID associated with it. This way, you will only have to create once a single purchase tied to that specific article ID, and then it will be simply applied every time for that particular page. And that's it. Bear one thing in mind though. Just like we have had in our previous video a time pass, which was associated with two articles, that is Economist Article 1 and Economist Article 2, that is this time pass here. We defined this time pass for these two articles, but it's valid for both of them, meaning that if you buy a 4-hour access for Economist Article 1, it doesn't apply only to this article, but it applies to both of them. So if you would buy it here, both 1 and 2 would be unlocked. Same applies when using article ID, or that is when binding purchasing options with article ID. So bear that in mind when you are creating it, because you would usually use article ID for subscriptions or time passes, not really for single article purchases, although such use cases are possible as well. Again, this is completely up to you. Now let's put some of the things we've learned here in practice. One of the benefits of using article ID as outlined before is that you can just drop this article ID wherever you want, and you can have the purchasing option you have defined before just magically appear on it. Well, let's put this onto test. I have created a new sports article 1 here, which, as you can see, is in a completely different category. So even the URL path here, or the URL prefix, actually is different. The structure of this article is the same, so these 3 paragraphs belong to a hide me class, and this is a teaser class. That means we can use the same template as the one we have used before. So the only thing we have to modify here is to go again into the source code of this web page and to add the article ID to this web page. So let's do that. This is how the source code looks like. And you have seen this before. As you can see, it looks very similar to Economist Article 1, 2, and 3, just that there is some sport keywords here, but everything else is the same. Just like we've seen with Economist Article 1, we can define our article ID here by simply inputting a script type application JSON ID LaterPay Connector. So that is the in-page configuration, where we specify the article ID again as single purchase. Now uploading this to the server, propagating all the changes there, going back to our sports article here, refreshing it, we're going to see that the overlay has appeared. So, mission accomplished. That was a bit way too easy, right? Let's play around a little bit more. Another thing that the in-page configuration allows us is to associate multiple IDs with a single article. So we can have an array of different IDs and then have different purchasing options referencing those IDs. So it would be really nice if we would add to this purchase overlay a subscription to all sports articles, for example, or using the article ID. So let's do that. For that, let's go back into our source code here and let's focus on the article ID here. And now what we need to do is, instead of having a single identifier here behind this keyword, which is the article ID keyword, we need to add a JSON structure which is called arrays, which means that we can add multiple values to one single keyword. And arrays look something like this, so we need to put square brackets around this value. And then in order to add a second value, we need to add to put a comma to separate the two values, and then we can add the value like this. So now in order to add the value, we're just gonna put a keyword here, and let's call these subscriptions sports subscriptions. Don't forget to propagate these changes to your server. And then let's go back to the connector dashboard and let's create a new subscription. Let's call this subscription Sports Articles. Subscribe to all the sports articles. Something like this. Again, here it's important to specify that this is linked to an article ID. Let's paste the article ID that we have created there before in the array. Let's put it for 1 month. And let's set the price to $2.50. Pay now. Finally, we're going to associate this with a template and save. We can see now that this has been added to the list of our subscriptions. And if we navigate back to our sports article 1 here, if we refresh it, we're going to see the sports article subscription that is applied to this article. Now remember, Economist article 2 will probably not have this, and that works fine. The reason for this is that Economist article 2 has defined only the single purchase article ID. So only the single purchase option applies to it. Whereas Sports article ID has both of them defined, both of these options defined via article ID. One of them is the single purchase, as we have seen, and let's look again in the source code, single purchase, and we have defined the single purchase option there. And finally, we have the second one, which is the subscription, which we have just created now, and that is associated with it via the sports subscription. You can add as many article IDs here as you want. Just again, I want to stress this again, keep in mind that whenever article IDs are tied between different articles, they are all going to share the same purchasing option. So that means if I would buy here this subscription, all the other sports articles which have this ID in there are going to be unblocked from that moment. So that's it. This video has showed us how to define in-page configuration, that is how to define an article ID via in-page, and how to use this in reference with all the purchasing options that we will define in the connector dashboard.